Greetings and bienvenue, MITZU. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Tonight's Halloween special is the complete Nic the Watcher story. Every other video on this subject uses the same incomplete screenshots. Please refer to the timestamp if you wish to skip to the part that has never been seen on YouTube or anywhere in over a decade.
Right after high school, I moved out to the Midwest. I have nothing for me here on the West Coast and needed to get away from the drama that my life was tied up in. My parents offered me no support. My friends were deadbeats, and the girl I had loved had lost interest in me. Instead of being a deadbeat and being a bum and working at Pizza Hut till I was 30, I moved away from the town I lived in and settled down 1,000 miles east of where I was born and raised. There I met Nic. He was tall, thin, and had eyes that were completely black. He worked at a morgue or a funeral home or something. He handled dead bodies, picked them up, dropped them off, dressed them up, and cremated them. When Nic and I hung out and did stuff together, things would always happen. Things that couldn't be explained by me or any logic I possessed at the time. I knew very little of Nic, never met any family, and didn't learn anything of his past. He lived alone and, as far as I know, never hung out with anyone but me. He was dark-haired and had black eyes. He was taller than me. I am about 6 foot even, and he was very thin. He drove an old car like a Crown Victoria or something similar. Old classic ride. We met at a Blockbuster. I asked him about a movie. He said it was bad and suggested a different movie. I thanked him and went on my way. Every time I entered that Blockbuster, he was there. Every time. Never failed. Whether it was 8 a.m. or 11 p.m., he was there. Never said hi, never acknowledged me. I asked the employees if he worked there or anything. They said no. Was just a customer who watched a lot of movies. I shrugged it off and just started paying attention to his choices. Typically foreign and horror films. Documentaries as well. Management guessed he had seen every movie in the store twice. I approached him again and asked him for a movie choice. He suggested a movie called Martyrs, saying it was a decent watch but had a silly ending. I kept pressing him for movies before finally asking him if he wanted to hang out. I was new in town, and apparently all he did was watch movies. He agreed and met me a couple of times for dinner. We traded numbers, but he didn't have texting. He had a very old phone, like an early model Nokia. We went to a place for some burgers and shared dinner. I told him about where I was from, where I stayed, and what I did for work. It was a little awkward at first. All he did was nod and make small comments. When asked where he was from, he shrugged or said, "Depends," or "I don't remember." I took that as, it's personal, so I just dropped it. After dinner one night, that's really all we did at first. He said he wanted to go drive around. I agreed, deciding I had nothing better to do, and exploring the new city sounded fun. We hopped in his ride, rolled down the windows, and cruised around for a bit. He didn't say anything and just listened to an old cassette he had playing in the car. It was boring, but it was something. We continued to cruise around for most of the night. We passed off one of the main road and winded through an older neighborhood. We slowly passed out of the city and into a smaller town, out of the brick and mortar and into the forest. The smell of the air changed from pollution to death. Literally, the forest smelled like there was piles of rotting animals or something. I asked to roll up my window, but he ignored me. We followed the same road for miles until there were no houses. The smell got worse and worse, to a point where I had to pull my shirt over my nose. The street turned into a dirt road and we passed over a set of railroad tracks. The street lights disappeared and we were swallowed up by the dark forests. Ahead of us was a single light. It illuminated part of a tall wooden fence. Nic brought the car to a stop and shifted it into park. He didn't turn and look at me, just looked forward. I did the same, watching the hazy light flicker against the fence. 10 or 20 minutes passed before I saw anything. A figure passed underneath the street lamp, a short, thin, bipedal creature. It stepped out quickly from the darkness and stood directly beneath the light. I inhaled quickly and turned to Nic. He watched it without any concern. He turned the lights of his vehicle off, apparently not wanting to disturb it. "I come here and watch them from time to time," he explained. I asked what it was. He shrugged. The creatures didn't remain in the light for long. It dropped to all fours and quickly scurried out of sight. I shook my head, confused. Was it a person? A bear maybe, standing on its hind legs? I asked Nic, but he had no answer. I continued to watch the street lamp. Time passed before I realized I had no idea where the creature went. It would be anywhere around us. My eyes drifted from the light to the trees, winding slowly along the shadowed details of the forest. I turned my head completely to the side and saw the last thing I wanted to see, a pair of eyes staring right back at me. It was a dozen feet away from the car, a small dark face staring at me. It looked like it had a snout, but its facial features were that of a human. I screamed. I won't even lie about it. I shrieked as loud as I could and pointed at it. I turned to Nic, who didn't seem fazed by my cowardliness. He squinted at it and shifted the car into reverse and back out of the woods and headed back towards the city. On the drive back, he explained to me that they were some kind of creatures that lived out on the north side of the city in the woods. I was in disbelief, but it was obviously true. I saw them. He told me that he had discovered them while driving around a long time ago and had observed them ever since. He asked if I would go out there with him from time to time and check on them with him. I agreed, not sure if I had a choice. The creatures really aren't even the story here. They are the least exciting thing to happen with Nic and I. Ghosts, a demon, a cult in the forest, possessed homeless people, and a slew of other stories are all ready to be told. Just ask away. I see 2 people requesting the cult story. I can do this. Where I resided, there was a place called the Purple Church, an old urban legend that there was a church, in the same general area as those little scouted creatures, that had been corrupted by its pastors back in the late 1980s, I believe. They started sacrificing people and did a complete 180, worshipping Jesus to Satan. The place was closed down and condemned, but people continued to practice rituals and sacrifices out there. It got so bad, and the crime rate was so high out there, killing animals, assault on people hiking in the woods, people disappearing, that the police went to the church during the day, roped it off, and were ordered to burn it to the ground. Well, being the /x/file that I was, I did some research on creepy places in the state I was in and found that. I told Nic about who nodded. I stated I wanted to go there and he agreed, saying we would do so at night. During the day it was boring. He had clearly been out there before. He didn't ask any questions about it. The sun set and his old car pulled up to my house. I left the place with my switchblade, mace, phone, mag light, and a lighter. I wasn't screwing around. Everything I read said this place was dangerous. We drove out the same way to get to the creature, but followed the road past the lamp and the fence and into the actual forest. There were several abandoned houses, and if my eyesight wasn't failing me, there were small piles of ruined vehicles out in the woods. When we got past the lamp, he turned the lights of his vehicle off and parked it off the street behind some bushes. I asked him why, and he said it was too loud, it would get us caught. We proceeded on foot. Throughout the forest, I could hear the roaring of truck engines, all throughout the woods. I thought little of it, expecting rednecks and drunk off-roaders. I was wrong. As I followed Nic down the path, he explained that people still came out here, even lived out here to worship the church. I laughed a little. He stopped and asked what was funny. I said nothing, like an embarrassed child, and walked on. We passed by a bathtub and it smelled terrible. I found it odd there was a porcelain tub out in the middle of the woods, so I pointed the flashlight over at it and turned it on. Inside were dozens of dead animals, some fresh, some nothing but bones. I gagged and turned the light off, but it was too late. "Hey!" I heard someone scream from the forest, apparently giving away our position. I turned to run, tearing off down the trail and deeper into the woods. To this day, I don't know where Nic went. I turned behind me and saw no sign of him. I don't know if he ran another direction, was on the other side of me, even in front of me. He was just gone. A truck with no headlights roared into view, half a dozen people loaded into the back with a spotlight and weapons. I bolted into the thick of the woods and dove into a pile of brush and logs. It was a decent hiding spot, mainly because I couldn't be seen at all. It was almost like a beaver's den. Men came off the trail and began exploring the woods. They had machetes and hatchets from what it looked like. Thankfully, all the light they had was from the spotlight mounted on the back of the truck. The men came closer and closer, weaving through the trees and grass carefully. It wouldn't be long before they found me. Then I heard a crash. The spotlight shattered, the illumination it provided dying away and leaving the landscape in a blackness so deep I couldn't see anything. The men complained and asked for the light to be turned back on. There was no response from the men on the back of the truck. It grew completely silent as everyone realized what was happening. There was someone else out here. All of a sudden, a man screamed to my right. I turned to look, but I couldn't see anything. One by one, shrieks erupted around me, each man being attacked by something. The men were being tossed around like dolls, slammed into trees and beat into submission by a tall, thin figure. Before I could make an escape, a hand wrapped around my mouth from behind. I struggled for a moment, turning to find it was Nic. He beckoned me on and followed him back to his car. We trotted silently through the woods and left the same way we had come. I still don't know what happened out there. It could have been him that thrashed all those guys, but how did he get right behind me? It was so strange. I was terrified. We got to his car and headed home. He dropped me off without saying a word. Whenever we chilled, we would hang at my house. My roommate had gotten a girlfriend, so my house became a war zone and we didn't like to chill there anymore. So I asked Nic if we could kick it at his place. He hesitated and finally said okay. It was a pretty dull place, a 2-bedroom house. Older building, pretty plain. Nothing out of the ordinary. We had chilled there and watched movies and ate pizza a couple nights a row before another weird thing happened. We were sitting in his living room watching some movie on Netflix when out of nowhere, his door to his bedroom, which is clearly visible from the couch, explodes open. It was closed and latched as far as I know. And out of nowhere it slams against the wall like someone kicked it open. I turned to look at him. He looked at the door for a split second and then went back to watching the movie. I asked if that was normal and he said yeah. I had crashed over at his place that night. I slept on the couch. He slept in his room. The entire night I slept facing the couch. All I could hear from the time we went to bed until the sun rose was someone walking around his house. Footsteps pattering from room to room, but Nic had never left his room. I don't know if it was a ghost or a demon. Something was walking around and had kicked his door open. Well, I asked about it, yeah, but the thing with Nic was that I never got an answer from him. Not a direct one. I asked who was walking around his house. He said he didn't know its name. I'm just like, WTF, what is it? He shrugged. That shrug used to drive me nuts, but I got used to it. Another time we were outside smoking cigars in his backyard. I had picked them up on a whim just because. So we are puffing on these things on his back porch, sitting in chairs and enjoying the night. Suddenly the lights in his house go off. I turn to look. He doesn't, nothing ever bothered him. He was never concerned about anything. I could hear the familiar footsteps padding around his house. I did my best to ignore it and continued to talk to Nic. He got up and walked out from the porch and out into the moonlight, stretching his legs, I guess. I took this opportunity to turn around and peek into the house. Inside, a few lights were on. The light from his fish tank, the light from a clock. It provided just enough light to allow me to see a figure walking from room to room, a shadowy being darting from the hallway to the kitchen and every room in between. I called out to Nic, who turned and asked me what was wrong. I pointed at the being. Nic approached me and looked inside. The being snapped around and faced us. I couldn't make out a single detail of its person. It stared at us for a moment before disappearing deeper into his house. Nic placed his cigar on the table and entered the house, asking me to remain outside, which I did. He followed it back into his room. I watched his window, which had the curtains drawn over it. Time passed and I simply sucked on my cigar, waiting for something to happen. There was finally a flash of light from the room. White light, not light from a bulb. After the flash, the lights in his house came back on and he exited his home and sat down beside me and continued smoking his stogie. Stuff like that would happen from time to time in his house. Once I was in the shower at his place after I'd crashed there. While showering, the lights went out in the bathroom. It was uncomfortable because I thought Nic was in there. I pulled the curtain back and reached for the light and flicked it on. The door was still locked. Other times doors would be kicked open by nothing, much like that first night. Any night I slept there, I would hear the person walking around his home or hear whispers or knocking. One night I showed up at his place on a Friday with some alcohol and the new Dead Space game. I brought my Xbox and all that and said we were staying up all weekend playing this game. He didn't want to, but finally gave in. I mixed some drinks and hooked up my 360 to his TV and the fun began. An hour or so went by and we were both slamming back drinks. He was taking it hard. He changed. He wasn't as stoic, but he was weird. He had an accent. Not a fake one, like a legitimate accent that I had a little trouble understanding. Italian or French. I have no idea. His language varied, not always speaking English, and he was actually smiling and having fun. We got to a part in Dead Space 2 that we could not beat and got bored and started talking and just generally dicking around. He took me into his room and showed me his knives. He had a knife hidden under his pillow and one by his windowsill and another hidden inside a book. He showed me maps and leather-bound books and tomes of information. Some written in weird languages, all written about weird things. Some how to hunt, others how to make traps, but not any kind of mammal I know about. He had a bear trap in his closet and a small compact shotgun tucked into the corner. A small pile of stakes, like a vampire slayer, were also piled in the closet. Or should I call it an armory? It was stocked with weapons. I took these pictures at his place. I swear to God he was looking away from me. These were on my old phone. When I took them, we were both sitting on his bed facing the TV playing the Xbox. In the photo, he is clearly facing me. When I took it, he was facing to the left side of the picture. I am WTFing right now. I don't know if he turned real fast or just knew I was taking a photo. Or if he could change them. I don't know, WTF. I'll leave the one photo up for reference, but won't post anymore. I feel weird. Like he knows I am telling people all of this. Oh well, too late now. Another story. I got a call from him one day after work and told me to meet him at his place of work at about 11 p.m. I agreed and said I would be there. He worked just a few miles from my house at a morgue or something. Dead bodies in and out of there. Funeral home maybe. He drove around and picked up dead bodies from the city and dressed them up and made them look presentable. He liked to talk about it from time to time. He enjoyed his work. I pulled up at the building at the designated time to find only his vehicle in the parking lot. I got out of my car, locked it, and approached the door. I yanked on the handle to find it was locked. Confused, I made a few laps around the building and even peeked inside Nic's car to find absolutely no sign of him. I called him a few times before I finally spotted him by the tree line, the small patch of forest that separated the building from the acute graveyard it had. He beckoned me over and disappeared back into the trees. I made my way over to the trees and waded through the brush until I stood in the cemetery. Again, Nic was gone and I couldn't see him anywhere. I wandered between the headstones for a while before seeing an open grave. The hole was dug, but there was no casket or body within, ready for a burial the following day I had assumed. I meandered over to it and peered inside to find Nic. He was laying on his back, hands placed behind his head, relaxing. He stared up at the stars and the moon. He glanced at me briefly and looked back to the sky. I plopped down on the side of the grave and let my legs hang freely, careful not to knock any dirt loose onto Nic. We spoke briefly of the day, how work was and what we had for lunch. Small talk mostly. "Do you trust me?" he asked. I arched an eyebrow at him and nodded. He asked nothing more of it, remaining silent. I asked him the same question, honestly curious about the answer. "I do." With that, he hopped up and pulled himself out of the grave. After dusting himself off, he led me into his place of work, the door opening easily to his touch. No key, no button. It simply pulled right open even though it had been locked not 20 minutes before. We entered the funeral home and passed through the small welcoming lobby. It had a few chairs, the main counter, and a vase with flowers placed on a sturdy wooden table. He led me through the main hall back into the dressing room. Inside was a wall of drawers, each drawer used to store and keep bodies cool. I wasn't comfortable at all, but he wanted me to see something, apparently. He showed me the tables where they operated and made people look presentable. Sewing equipment, makeup, everything. He had shelf after shelf of tools and objects he used for work. Scalpels, scissors, needles, thread, eyeliner, and more. Racks of clothing were found across from the tables, dresses to suits and everywhere in between. And then there was a tall door. "Sorry guys, worked a 14-hour shift at work and needed to sleep. I am back for a short while." As for the questions and comments below, I never saw him with anyone else. Even when I would stop by his work in the middle of the day in the middle of the work week, the whole place was entirely empty. Never saw another car there. I entertained the thought that he owned the place and was the only one that worked there. Or maybe the place isn't even there at all and I am the only one who can see it. As for him knowing I typed that, you may be right. He actually gave me a call yesterday. Had no real topic brought up, just asked a few questions, direct ones. "Where have you been? Can I still trust you?" Stuff like that. All went well and I didn't feel threatened. As for the light post creatures, we saw them several times. I don't know if he looked after them or he hunted them or what. I was never there for any kind of confrontations. We would just drive out there and observe them. A few times they approached the car and even touched the windows. This one night, Nic and I had driven downtown into this old, urban decayed brick and mortar side of the city. Pretty much abandoned, pretty late, and didn't see anyone else around. He said he liked to come to this side of the city to just wander around. We did that for about an hour. All the while, he interviewed my beliefs on aliens and religion. We turned a corner around this old building and saw a raggedy man standing about 20 feet down the sidewalk from us, totally still just standing there. We both stopped and watched the guy for a moment. We shared looks before Nic stepped forward and started approaching. I wasn't frightened. I mean, Nic may be taller, but I lift. 6 foot, 220, and I had been going to a boxing gym for about a year at the time. Still, something was just creepy about the whole situation. The man was clearly homeless and somehow aware we were going to be coming around that corner. Nic took a second step forward before the man started howling. I mean, just shrieking. His mouth opened and he let loose a blast of hair. It was mind-numbing. I closed my eyes and pressed my hands to my ears. A moment passed before the screaming stopped. I dropped my hands back to my sides and opened my eyes. The homeless man was now standing toe-to-toe with me, literally not an inch from my nose. I yelped, stepping back. How the hell did he get from that far away to being that close in a matter of seconds without me hearing him? I took another step back. The man smelled awful, like charred flesh and death. His eyes were white and his breath smelled like roadkill. I looked around for Nic and he was nowhere to be found. The man grunted and continued to make animal-like noises. I was walking backwards at a steady pace now. I got a few more feet away before I bumped into something. Relief flooded through, assuming it was Nic. I turned to find a second grungy, rough-looking man with the same white eyes and smelling of death. Air caught in my throat as I quickly checked my surroundings, seeing a dozen of these bums coming out of alleyways, climbing fences, all approaching me. I was done playing. I grabbed the closest guy and went to push him to the ground. He was incredibly strong and completely overpowered me. He grabbed me by both arms and slammed me into the wall, knocking the wind and wits out of my body. I slumped to the floor and pressed my eyes closed. My head rang from the impact of the brick wall and the lack of air in my lungs. I could hear the steady sound of approaching footsteps, realizing I was probably surrounded. I looked up but continued to squint. My head was in too much pain to be able to see correctly. Before I could ask for them to stop, there was a flash of light, similar to the flash of light that came from Nic's window that one night. The homeless man howled in disgust. I could hear a scuffle begin, some kind of struggle. The pound of bone to skin and the slump of bodies to the floor or into the wall. Several minutes went by with flashes of light and strikes being thrown into someone's body. Finally, I felt a pair of strong, slender hands pick me up. I am not sure if I was slung over someone's shoulder or cradled like a baby. I may have been dragged. I am not sure. I just remember being sat in the leather seat of Nic's old car and the familiar tunes of his cassette player. I woke up the following morning in my bed with some bruises. The demon story started at St. Vincent's. We had gone there for some urban exploring and heard it was haunted. He said he had never been there and seemed excited, actually. We drove by it a few times to scout it out. It was an old ransacked building right off a main road. We didn't see any security or homeless people, so we waited for the traffic to slow down, and we made our move. We parked across the street and hightailed it from one side to the other. We made a few loops around the building, double-checking to make sure it was truly empty. We entered it and wandered around the two leveled buildings. It was totally destroyed, being defaced and torn apart beyond all recognition. We picked through some of the rubble before it got dark and found nothing. The sun set and we left to avoid garnering attention and vowed to return after the work week. St. Vincent's is my favorite. Like I said, we went back out there after about a week and did some more exploring. We sifted through the top floor from corner to corner. There was a ton of stuff up there. In one room, there was a desk with a bunch of old candles melted on it. In this office, I discovered a fireproof safe. Those old little lockboxes, tan in color. It was behind a filing cabinet, under some rubble. We tried to jimmy it open, but the tumblers wouldn't give it to my untrained hands. Nic messed with it for a while and had the same results. We placed it where we found it, realizing it could be a drug deal or something serious. Suddenly uncomfortable, we headed downstairs to continue our expedition. On the ground floor, the place was thrashed, like a tornado had swept through. Chunks of the walls were missing, graffiti and trash. In one room, though, there was a single yellow balloon tied to a chair. The balloon was new, still floating with fresh helium. It couldn't have been older than a few hours. It was creepy, but we ignored it. In retrospect, that's pretty dumb of us. Someone had obviously been down there to tie the balloon to the chair. We raked through the debris, searching for anything of interest. That's when we heard it. Footsteps treaded softly above us. Someone was on the second floor. They were light-footed, making the softest sound. I turned to Nic, who was staring at the ceiling, listening. The steps stopped and I inhaled. The thought of someone up there had totally petrified me. Something crashed to the floor, a board or a box maybe. The footsteps grew heavy and aggressive, now stomping and knocking things over. A shadow passed over the staircase. Nic and I immediately retreated into a smaller room and hid behind a desk. Twilight had set in and darkness was not consuming the building. The steps pounded violently down the stairs. The being walked heavily throughout the ground floor, rarely stopping for any length of time. I was wide-eyed, staring at Nic for an answer. All he did was shrug. Finally, we heard the creature step into the room we were in. It stood motionless, heavy breathing coming from it. The room began to smell like charred flesh and vomit. It was hard not to gag, but I prevailed, stifling my hacking cough. The creature actually spoke. "There is no need to hide, Santos. Never return here." It spoke deep and grumbling, like its throat was swollen and its lungs were filled with fluid. It then exited the room and the building. We waited a few minutes before coming out from behind the desk. Nic stood first and hopped over the old wooden piece of furniture. I did the same, planting a hand on the top of the cold splintered wood and swinging my legs over to the other side. All Nic would say is that we needed to leave, and so we did. We didn't go back upstairs, instead exiting through a broken window and sprinting across the courtyard and street until we reached his car. He thrust the key into the ignition and gave it a turn, the old engine roaring to life. On the drive home, I asked him what it was and where it came from. He shrugged, but I shook my head. That shrug wasn't going to work this time, so I continued to pry for answers. Finally, he gave in. "I'm not sure what it was. Far too dark for a ghost. Ghosts don't speak, not like that. It was a demon if I had to guess. Something bound to the building. That place is evil. I could taste the malice there." I then asked who Santos was. He explained that was his last name, that the demon knew who he was, which wasn't good. I shook my head. Nic continued to tell me that we needed to find the key to the lockbox. He wanted to see its contents. I agreed to help him find the key on one condition, that he include me in the adventures. I wanted to know more about what was going on and not be kept in the dark. He reluctantly agreed as he dropped me off. Nic pulled his sleeves up, exposing his arms. I had never seen him without a long-sleeved shirt on and was surprised to see his skin covered in scripted tattoos. We said goodnight and I went to bed. Nic and I took our sweet time returning to St. Vincent's. A couple work weeks passed. We both worked Monday through Friday typically, and caught dinner, a couple movies, and generally chilled out. The encounter with the demon at the abandoned building was a little startling, mainly for me. But even Nic seemed put off by it. Finally, he made the statement. He wanted to go back. He made the call early on a Saturday and said we would depart later in the evening. I agreed and told him I would be ready. The day passed quickly because I was pretty excited and nervous to return to St. Vincent's. Finally, the sun began to set, and I heard the familiar roar of Nic's car in the driveway of my house. It was a quick trip over to the old brick building. We parked across the street again and slipped over the asphalt and into the depths of St. Vincent's. We made short work of the upper level, scoping out the few corners we hadn't checked on the trip prior. We pulled the lockbox out of the rubble and placed it on the wax-covered table nearby. After securing the lockbox and searching the top floor, we descended to the first level and slowly began combing through the trash and debris. We stayed silent in the darkness, using small LED lights to illuminate our way. I think the reason we stayed quiet was fear of stirring the demon up again. At least that was my reason. An hour passed and still we had no results. It was disheartening, realizing we're literally looking for a needle in a haystack. Maybe the key isn't here. Maybe the owner took the key and forgot the box, I offered sheepishly. Nic shook his head with complete confidence. He was convinced the key was there. Why would someone take the key but not the valuables? He questioned. I agreed and continued the search. I found info on St. Vincent's and on the murders. Can't link you, using my phone. It came top on the search, St. Vincent's Home for Boys, Oklahoma. We continued the search well into the night before finally we caught on to something. I had tried to open one of the drawers on the desk on the bottom floor, the same desk we had hid behind when the demon came. It held fast against my touch, not pulling open to reveal its contents to me. I made note of this and told Nic, who quickly began working the drawer open. First we tried brute force, yanking, kicking, and just beating the desk. Nothing worked. Nic reached into his pocket and produced a blade. Nothing fancy. A straight blade maybe 6 or 7 inches with a thin leather sheath. He bent down and began to pry the drawer away from the desk, deciding to just break it open. A few minutes passed before finally I heard a crack and the drawer plopped down to the ground. Inside there were several folded papers, a schedule from the 1980s. Names we didn't know and listed times and places were in a certain order. Even a grocery list was among the papers, but at the bottom we saw the faint glisten of an old key. It was a simple key, much simpler than I thought it would be. We cheered in joy, literally. Or at least I did. Nic didn't seem surprised to find the key. I, on the other hand, was completely ecstatic. We took hold of the key and ascended the concrete stairs to the 2nd floor. Nic led us straight to the box and slid the key into the lock. A simple twist of his hand moved the tumblers and brought the box right open. Inside was more papers and several very yellowed old folders. We already knew about the murders and the happenings of St. Vincent when it was open and in use in the years before. These papers elaborated on the killings, the people involved, and all the incidents leading up to the deaths of the employees, patients, and the very owner and operator of the Home for Boys. There were files on each of the people involved in the murders, written conversations, journal notes, and even predictions. Whoever owned the lockbox was aware of the incidents that happened in St. Vincent's Home for Boys and did nothing about them. The notes described a tangible presence that was turning things for the worst. This being had made itself known over the years but had affected one employee particularly, a male nurse. He spoke and babbled of it regularly.
Hey, OP, you said Nic trained you. Due to what? What was it like? What all did you find out? Come on, you can't just tease us like that. Tell us more.
Well, the encounters with the demon grew worse and worse. We got involved in some weird stuff like uncovering the additional information about the murders of St. Vincent. He showed me how to track spirits, how to sense them. Seeing them takes years. What kind of beasts reside where, how to handle them, and which are hostile. He taught me survival stuff, like stuff you would find in a scout's handbook, how to build traps and stuff, track things. He taught me eskrima, which is a form of Filipino knife fighting. He tried to teach me energy usage, but I have no skill with it at all. He said it would take time, but I have little patience for it.
Have you ever wondered if there would be consequences for your actions, OP? Demons coming after you and certain death or satanic cults?
Every day. Death is actually what brought me here. Nic and I had an encounter where we saw our deaths. I have reason to believe mine could be coming soon, so I decided to come out and explain as much as I can without going against the order. Not really an order, but whatever it's called. Any more questions?
Why do you think you'll die soon? What is the order?
The oracle that provided us with the vision. Well, long story short, my vision had a bit of dialogue in it. I heard that bit of dialogue recently, meaning my death could possibly happen soon. The order is just what I call it. I don't think it really has a name. It's just a collection of people like Nic spread out across the globe. Watcher, protectors. People who keep the paranormal in line and the soon-to-be extinct creatures in secret. There are so few that they mostly know each other by name. Some take on apprentices, train new people for new areas or if they think they need help. The group has been in action for a long, long time. Since the Crusades, from what I understand. Nic has been a member for what seems like decades. He makes it seem like he is very, very old.
Can you tell us of your most disturbing incident with Nic? Like something that really left you distraught after it happened?
Something that really messed me up. They all had heavy effects on me, to be honest. Once we were tracking this thing through the forests way southeast of the city, out by a lake. Pets had been disappearing. We found a pile of dead dogs and cats, torn apart and snacked on by something with hands. That had me pretty twisted, seeing all these dogs that had owners waiting for them at home. There was this time Nic had called me up in the middle of the night, like 2 a.m. I had been sleeping and had work in a few hours, but Nic insisted I go with him. He claimed he had a dream and it needed to be investigated. We went downtown to this old part of the brick city, abandoned, near where the bums attacked us. We went to one of the big buildings, a boarded-up abandoned theater, like Broadway, theatrical play, theater, balconies and a large stage and whatnot. There was a vampire living inside that was feasting on the homeless. The place smelled like blood, was terrifying because it was talking to us.
What did your conversation consist of? You'll have to forgive me for being a little skeptical on this, though.
It talked to me mostly, asked me questions, mostly about why I had come to that state, what food I liked, what my hobbies consisted of if I missed my family, asked if I believed in God or religion, mostly just curious about things. It crawled along the darkness of the roof and through the rafters, scurrying along the stage floor and all throughout the darkness. Never stayed still for very long. Very pale, long, dark hair that was greasy and very thin. Nic ignored it, searching throughout the theater for hidden people, bodies, trying to catch the being and other things. They talked briefly. It didn't seem interested in Nic. They had probably met before. He could have just been doing a checkup on it. Its name was Lucas or Lucas, however it's spelled. Sounded very French or German, not very good with accents.
So, OP, you said you have moved back to the West Coast. Are you acting as a watcher over that area now? If so, what are the creatures, etc., that you check in on? Could you give us a list? Also, what is the purpose of those checkups?
Yes, I am. Making sure they are staying populated, no issues with them becoming extinct. Making sure they stay fed, not having any issues with the wildlife. Making sure they stay out of human territory and hidden in the wild. Creatures over here consist of a Bigfoot-type creature that lives on the Mogollon Rim. They are like sloths that live on the mountains and forests and canyons up north. Very tall, muscular, and furry. Extremely long arms with massive talons on the end. For reference, try looking up Mogollon Monster. There were some newspaper sightings back in the day. There is one spider in Sedona, only one. It is massive, bigger than a car. That is the biggest chore of this state, keeping it away from the mountain faces and towns. A breed of goblin or something similar lives in the deserts out here. Long-eared, green-gray skin, sharp teeth. Live north of the Grand Canyon and south by Tombstone. Out in the middle of nowhere and holes in the ground. They can communicate and are very easy to deal with. As long as we provide them with monthly food and luxuries, they agree to stay underground most of the day. Big snakes, big lizards. Typical vamps residing in old buildings and caves. Were-beings, demons, ghouls, hybrids, possessed folks. We read through the files of St. Vincent with pretty much pure disgust. The files inside explained a being wandering the halls of St. Vincent and speaking with the caretakers. One of the nurses, a young man, was particularly affected by this and made several complaints about being infested and being tempted to end life. The owner did nothing about it and simply recorded the happenings on paper. After the man committed the murders and was convicted, the demon turned its eyes on the owner and began harassing him. He tried to ignore and get rid of the demon, but to no avail. For fear of his life, he continued to write down the events until finally he was murdered in his home. The demon came to the home for boys out of malevolence and took one life after another. As for Nic and I, after we discovered the papers inside the lockbox and found out the truth of the boys' home, that the demon had poisoned it with his cruelty, we were torn between what to do for our next move. I demanded we take the newfound documents to the police. Nic suggested we hide the evidence and continue to dive deeper into the mystery. Being the greenhorn of the group, I decided to take Nic's advice and help him hide the evidence. We took the key, the lockbox, and all the other important things we had found and left the building. Nic spent every night at my house for about a week, together studying the notes and the information we could find online. Nic made the assumption that the demon was called Andreas, a vicious demon of hell. We continued to study up on Andreas and how he functioned. Nic planned on facing him. Nic continued to study and ready himself for the conflict. There wasn't much I could do to assist, so I mostly just watched and learned from him. Nearly a week had passed before he finally decided to return to St. Vincent's. We arrived at twilight like we always did. He stepped into the building and instantly poured a handful of salt behind on the threshold. He asked me to wait outside, not wanting to put me into any danger. Nic disappeared into the darkness of the building. I watched with a nervous eye as my friend approached his possible doom. Several minutes passed before I heard the familiar shuffle of heavy feet slamming against the ground. I heard the sound of the demons going, the guttural drawl of its distorted voice. Nic responded in a language I didn't know. I squinted, trying to make out any form in the shadows, or at least the words he was saying. A flash of light exploded for just a moment, illuminating the halls and rooms of the building. I spotted Nic with his hands placed together in front of him and the hunching, stalking figure. It had a horrific body, thin gray skin pulled tightly over a bony body. Feathers lined its head and talons stretched out from each hand and foot.
Andreas is the Grand Marquis of Hell. He appears to have the body of an angel and the head of a wood owl, and to be riding a black wolf and carrying in his hand a painted saber. He teaches those whom he favors to kill their enemies, masters, and servants. He stirs up trouble and dissension. He commands 30 legions.
Nic and the demon struggled inside the building for a while, probably 15 minutes. I could hear things being slammed into the walls, grunts and furniture being knocked to the floor. Flashes of light continued to erupt through the walls and out the windows. Every time the energy flashed from Nic's hands, the demon would shriek in frustration, but continue the battle with Nic. Finally, the building grew silent, and the fight stopped. I could hear heavy breathing coming from St. Vincent's and didn't know who it belonged to. I approached the door where Nic had poured the salt and peered into two dark figures standing there. I shined my flashlight into the darkness of the home to see Nic standing there with Andreas. The demon's hands were tied together, and he was being led by Nic towards us. Both of them were battered and broken, bleeding from multiple gashes and wounds. Nic stepped over the line of salt, and most of his cuts and bruises instantly healed. Andreas saw this and began to struggle, pulling at his binds and attempting to flee. The owl creature was an amazing size. An owl's head sat atop a very muscular body. Its hands ended in great talons, and so did its feet. Nic continued to yank the demon's leash closer and closer to the salt. Finally, Nic had the strength to give it a final tug, which sent Andreas tumbling over the line of salt, his body immediately disintegrating. The demon howled in pain for a moment before being broken down into raw energy and particles. Nic dropped the leash and raised his hands up before him. The energy that was Andreas rushed to his hands, balling up in his palms for a moment before becoming one with Nic. Nic's body seemed to swell for a moment, taking in the energy of Andreas's nearly being too much. Nic closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, his head shaking involuntarily. When he opened his eyes, they were completely black. I watched him in fear for a moment before his eyes went back to normal and the dark aura around him settled. I asked him what happened. He shrugged. Nic and I proceeded home, where we both slept. He very rarely slept over at my house, but it was no issue. He said he was too tired to head home and would leave in the morning. I said it was not a problem and set him up on a bed on the couch in the living room. He thanked me, and I departed to my room, where I slept for most of the night. I awoke to a lot of whispering throughout my house. I thought maybe Nic had turned the TV on, so I listened a little while I tried to fall back asleep. I realized it wasn't the TV immediately. It was several different voices whispering the name Nikolai. I slowly sat up and made my way to the door of my bedroom. My hand reached out and took hold of the knob. It was ice cold, far colder than it should have been. I turned the knob and cracked my door open. I could see a handful of figures standing around Nic's sleeping form, all of them whispering his name. I watched in horror, and they all reached out with thin arms and long fingers towards Nic. I screamed and rushed out of my room, surprising the beings. I knocked the closest one to the floor and began pushing the rest of them away. I was surprised I could touch. I had guessed they would have been like ghosts in the movies, instead expecting my hands to pass right through air. This was not the case, and I was able to push them around like any person could. The figures stumbled away and ran out the front door, Nic quickly waking up and standing next to me. I turned to him and he asked what was going on. I answered that I saw all the beings around him and stopped them from touching him. He nodded, asking what they were. It was my turn to shrug. I had no idea. "Where did they go?" he asked. I pointed at the front door, which was still open. He examined the couch and the floor around it, the floor near the door and the door itself. He took note of the air and any energy he found in it before turning back to me. His face was grim. He was clearly uncomfortable. I asked him if they were demons or wraiths of some kind. Nic shook his head. He inhaled before responding, wetting his lips. They were people, he answered. Humans. I didn't understand at first. What was the big deal? I was far more afraid of a ghost or a demon than I was of a person. Then it settled into the pit of my stomach, the feeling Nic had. People, living people knew where I lived. Humans took the time to break into my house. Were the followers of the Purple Church? Possessed homeless? Nic and I stayed up the rest of the night, Nic showing me how to properly secure my house and what it would take to dispatch any intruders. Nic helped me secure my house and armed me as well. My backyard was now a tightly knit wall of defense, salt-lined just about every threshold of the entire property. This was something that needed to be refreshed regularly, at least once a week. My front door now had an alarm on it. Nothing that would notify the police, just a cheap piece of plastic that would beep very loud when the door opened. All the windows were secure along with my garage as well. Nic returned one night with a backpack. He placed it on my kitchen table and unloaded it slowly, explaining to me each item and how to use it. Pepper spray, a straight knife, a handful of zip ties, a pair of Kevlar gloves, coolest thing I have ever seen, an old short wooden club with a wire handle and a cheap single dart crossbow, like the one from Walmart. Basic things, things that would protect me against one or two people. If it ever got out of hand, I had Nic's number. That was probably my best defense. I thanked Nic for the items and he left, leaving me along with my newly acquired armory and my fortified stronghold. The following weeks were dull on the paranormal side. I joined a bowling league, everyone bowls in Oklahoma, and started playing poker pretty regularly. Nic and I still hung out a couple nights a week, but I had a pretty big bank account and felt like spending money. Nic wasn't much for the social scene, which kinda bugged me. I like parties, people, and hanging out. He would get dinner and sit at home if he wasn't out banishing demons and tracking vampires. Nic received a letter one day and gave me a call, asking me to come over. I agreed, happy to have a new assignment. One thing that I really liked about the order was that most contact was made via written letters. I really thought that was awesome, but not so much anymore. It's a pain to write a watcher a letter, and I know it's going to take a day for him to see it. But it's official and it's pretty discreet. Write letter, send letter, read letter, burn letter. No traces, no IP address, no cached copies. This letter had to do with the dogs that were being eaten south of the city. The letter was from a girl named Becca. She was the Southern Watcher, operating out of Lawton, I believe. She sent the letter regarding some reports happening just north of her, pets disappearing and animals being found dismembered. She said it was technically in her area of jurisdiction but did not have the time or the manpower to get up there. Her and her current apprentice were tied up with a child of the forest. I still don't know what she was referring to. Could have been an elf, a troll, a beast. No idea. The children of the forest is a long, long list of creatures, being just a general term for something supernatural that does indeed live in the forest. Nic burned the letter and asked if I wanted to accompany him on the job. Naturally, I said yes. He told me to pack my things, weapons included, and he'd be at my house to pick me up a bit before sundown. I nodded and went back to my house to prepare my things. The sun was just starting to descend before Nic arrived. He came a little earlier than expected, which was fine. I was ready to go hours before he was there. I hopped in his car and we sped away to the southern part of the city, on the other side of Lake Thunderbird. That is where the reports had started. Campers losing their dogs and hikers finding mutilated animals. The first 2 nights we spent tracking. We came across a corpse or two, but nothing major. Nothing to suggest something was killing pets on purpose. The first night passed by quickly. We were both excited and ready to catch the vampire or great wolf or whatever supernatural being was out there. We didn't even find a footprint to track. Nothing. We found a dead rabbit, but thought nothing of it. The sun rose and we headed home for work. The following night we found a bit more. We found a pair of tracks to follow, bare human footprints that lead us through the forest on a winding path. The footprints were slender and long, almost inhuman. Nic and I stayed armed, me with the small handheld crossbow and him with a long straight knife. We tracked the prints all through the night but got no closer to our prey. We found a few strips of flesh on the path, but not enough to prove this was our pet killer. The sun was rising and we were both exhausted. We tied a bright ribbon to the nearest tree so we could find where we left off. Then we headed home. The following day we arrived a little early so we could use the sun to help us find the ribbon. It only took us 10 or 20 minutes, becoming pretty familiar with the area in just a few short nights. We found the tree and both laid beneath it, closing our eyes and resting before the hunt. Little sleep had come to either one of us, and any sliver of rest we could acquire was much needed. We slept until the sun dipped behind the mountains and we began our hunt. We followed the same set of tracks through the woods for an hour before we finally got confirmation. A dog paw and most of its lower leg laid in a small pool of blood on the side of the path. We inspected it but did not touch it. I felt a twang of guilt and disgust. A poor house pet being mauled and consumed in the darkness of the forest. We left the paw behind and continued the hunt. Nearly another hour had passed before we saw it. An old mill sprouting from the earth and reaching up over the trees. It was an aged building out of use for decades. The base of the building was a large barn with the mill rising from the far side of it. It was a large building, plenty of room for something to hide or live in. Nic waved for me to stay in the shadows of the trees while he approached slowly, knife in hand. He was only a few steps from the main opening when a noise echoed inside. The sound of something grunting. Before Nic could hide, a lengthy creature, imagine Gollum if he was 8 or 9 feet tall, came bolting out of the barn on all fours, sprinting into the wilderness. Nic was knocked backwards but instantly on his feet, chasing after the skinny creature. I sped off after him, not wanting him on his own and not wanting to be left near the barn. We chased the creature until sunrise but caught no other sign of it. It left us in the dust, literally, and we weren't able to catch up. We took note of the area and headed back home to rest and analyze what we had discovered. Nic didn't know what the creature was, which meant I had no idea. We had snagged a few hours of sleep, went to work, and then met again to go over our plan of proceeding. It was decided we would return to the mill during the daylight and investigate the inside. If we got into a confrontation with the beast, it would be easier to fight it in the daylight. After going over the inside of the mill, we would then set up some kind of trap to try and capture it. Kill it if we must. We would secure the mill and then wait in the forest and stake the place out. Wasn't happening that night though. We wanted to make it think it was safe again. If we gave it a night to itself, it might come under the illusion it lost us, either by fear or by outrunning us. We took to our beds that night, slept, woke, and worked. Right as we clocked off, we got our things together and headed out to the mill. Inside it was damp and old. Crates of tools and pallets were strewn about. Foot and handprints were all around, showing the size of the thing. Its hand was easily 2 or 3 of mine, making me feel a little weak in comparison. The bottom floor was pretty desolate, not holding a lot of evidence as to what this thing was. The second floor was covered in dried out hay, apparently where the thing slept. We climbed to the 3rd floor. The second we ascended the small ladder, it smelled like decaying flesh. Scattered all about the floor were dead animals, ranging from small house dogs to a full-grown elk, some of them rotten and mostly consumed, others freshly killed and still bleeding. We went right back down the ladder and back to the ground floor. Nic injected some of the bodies on the top floor with a tranquilizer. Nothing too powerful, just enough to get it to pass out. That was our first little trick. We dug a little trench around the backside of the barn in case it tried to run that way. Nothing too deep, just enough to cause it to stumble. Nic crafted a little net trap, like you see in cartoons. Weighted trap that Nic could spring by hand that would draw the beast into the air with a net. We spent the rest of the afternoon discussing the plan. We would let it return to the mill, go inside and get comfortable. If it ate the trank and fell asleep, Nic was going to kill it. When it got into the barn, I was to stand on the backside in case it tried to escape. If it did, I was to fire on sight with my mini crossbow. It was my first real assignment, and I was ready. Night settled in and we waited for 2 hours with no sign of it. I was starting to drift off to sleep when I heard something thrashing through the trees. It emerged slowly from the forest, a small struggling figure in its arms. I squinted to see that it held a dog, a large one. The dog whimpered, blood pumping freely from its wounds. The creature swifted the dog in its hands, breaking its bones and caused it to howl. The creature chuckled and sunk its teeth into the dog. I couldn't even watch, it was awful. The creature stepped into the mill and disappeared in the darkness, still snacking on the dog. Nic shook his head, obviously displeased. He stood and hurled a rock at the barn, the stone clattering loudly against the wood. The creature snarled and came bouncing back to the door, no longer holding the poor animal. Nic cut the rope that held the pallets in place, drawing the net up around the creature. The weight wasn't quite enough, though. The trap failed and only left the creature in a small enclosed cage made of the netting. Nic bolted from the trees and I worked my way around to the back of the barn. I saw a flash of light and heard the creature scream in pain. As I stepped from the trees and towards the barn, I turned to see the creature running towards me, away from Nic. I aimed at its leg and fired the crossbow bolt. It pierced the skin but didn't do the damage I had hoped. Instead, it continued running past me, knocking me into the mill. Nic then went sprinting by, weapons in hand. He gave me a brief glance, but I waved him on, slowly pulling myself to my feet. There was no way I could keep up with them, so I meandered back into the forest and sat down on a log, recovering from the impact against the barn. I was able to rest for maybe half an hour before Nic came back, panting and covered in sweat. I raised my eyebrows, questioning his success. He shook his head, sitting down next to me. I let him catch his breath before I started asking questions. I gained little information, for he still wasn't sure of what it was. "We won't see it again. It knows we're hunting it. Might not ever come back here," he explained. We gave up the mill and headed into the forest, searching for any signs of it. We spent the following week sweeping through the woods and around the lake. Never saw it again.
So, OP, tell me, what about Europe? If you would look around good enough and investigate, are there many places with such demons, beings, entities, vampires, possessed people, whatever? In particular, if possible, what about Slovenia? I wonder if it's possible in these ex-Yugoslavian countries to find any such places, just for research and stuff. Let's put aside people's safety. We have many woods here. And the adventurous person I always am, I wonder if there's any other type of life to find here. Thank you.
It isn't just America, I assure you. Globally, there are creatures, beings, and entities all over the world. You just need to know where to find them.
Well, how would you explain to, if you had one of your own students, the work you are doing? How would you introduce him to exploring and finding places with such creatures? Like, what kind of areas are the most probable chances of finding some creatures/entities? Big hills, deep forests, Alps? Places with a lot of mountains? Are they far away from cities or people in general? Or do they simply hide in their places and live nearby, like by the border of the town? Nearby here, not far from me. We have a very big mountain range, for example. Would that be any good? Although the area has many hikers, cyclists, etc. Simply please, if you could give out some tips on where and what to look after. Thanks.
What I would explain to my students: be careful. We lose a lot of first-timers because they get too confident. Most of the things you encounter can kill you without much resistance. You need to make sure you are properly prepared and always remember to keep your head straight. Intelligence is the biggest factor. As for where to look, on the outskirts of small towns. Creatures like to be near people sometimes, to watch us, smell the air, and steal from us. Go through the trash, maybe scare a little kid or steal a pie from a windowsill. This isn't all creatures, but some. For the ones that like to stay isolated, look in deep canyons or on the peaks of high mountains. Thick, undisturbed forests. Bring sugar cookies or rum and leave it out and see what creature decides to investigate.
I know that Nic Santos is really the star of this thread, but I'd like to hear more about the desert goblins and their warren.
Goblins live north of the Grand Canyon. Not a whole lot out there. Lots of different tribes all reside underground. We have an agreement with them. They can communicate with us. We provide food and stuff. They agree to stay away from humans and out of sight during the day. Each tribe has its own chieftain and council. They have their own hierarchy and laws. Some have small towns above ground, just a handful of buildings that stay abandoned during daylight. Things had gotten real quiet after that. The dog-eater was on the run and hadn't been giving us trouble, and the demon had been absorbed into Nic. There wasn't anything out of the ordinary to hunt or track. We did our monthly checkups on the creatures out in the woods, observing them for an hour or so every few weeks. We did our checkup on Lucas the vampire. He complained of being hungry and bored and threatened to start abducting people. We asked him not to and complied, but only if we brought him meat, and so we did, several pounds of raw beef. Things were pretty much kosher and Nic hated it. It got to a point where Nic was bored and somewhat irritated by it. We went on random hunts throughout the city and the forest and came up with nothing. He would go to random abandoned houses and enter them just looking for trouble. He needed something to cause distress. So we ended up going to Sylvia. She was an old woman who lived on the other side of town. By old, I mean 40s or 50s maybe. Not ancient, but not a young girl either. She lived in a small house with her daughter. Sylvia was a seer/oracle/soothsayer, whatever you want to call it. She had visions and accurate ones. Nic and I went to her requesting a vision to give us work. Whether it be a murder maiming a victim, a ghost moving stuff in someone's house, or a monster swimming at the bottom of a lake. She agreed to give us a vision but requested something. She wrote down a list, puffing on a cigarette all the while. When she was finished, she looked it over with a nod and handed it to Nic. He sighed, stood and led me out of the house. We hopped in his car and he fired it up, shaking his head. "She wants some items, some easy ones and some hard ones," Nic explained. "We'll start with an easy one." We drove to the heart of the city and parked the car in front of an older house. He got out and went right to the door, shaking the handle to find it locked. I shook my head confused. Nic stepped to the window and gave it yank, opening the house to us. Nic disappeared in the darkness of the home. With a shrug, I followed him. I was confused and very much so. I entered the house to find it barren of all furniture, empty of any inhabitants. Nic walked from room to room, checking each one. He then began talking out loud, asking questions. We received no answers and Nic left the house, hopping back into the car. I followed, still confused, and got back in the car. We did this exact same thing in 3 more houses before we finally got a result. We entered the house and Nic walked from room to room, asking questions and speaking in another language. Finally, he got a response. A dark figure stepped out from the back room, facing us from the hallway. Nic stopped and turned while I froze in even more confusion. Nic continued to speak in a language I didn't recognize, getting small responses from the being. The conversation stopped and the being took a step forward, still showing no details of what it was. Nic lunged forward, light blasting out of his hands. The creature shrieked for a single moment and then it was gone. Nic turned to face me, a small grin on his face. In his hand he held a little crystal. Nothing special or fancy, just a small gem you could find anywhere. Inside, a dark mist swirled around. "First item down," he muttered, pocketing the crystal. "A soul and its energy." I nodded, understanding now we had been checking abandoned homes for ghosts and demons. I guess the seer needed energy. From there, we went to St. Vincent's. Returning here wasn't what I wanted to do, but apparently there was an item on the list that was in here. Nic parked and turned to me. "Remember the balloon in here? On the back of the chair?" I nodded. "I need you to go get it." I gave him a blank look, not amused. Realizing he wasn't messing with me, I got out of the car and proceeded into the building. I stepped into the dark entrance and let my eyes adjust. It took a moment, but it was definitely worth it. I waited between the busted furniture and debris on the ground. I stepped silently and carefully, not wanting to stir any being within St. Vincent's. I reached the room with the chair and saw the balloon, resting gently on the ground. It had run out of helium apparently and would no longer float. I reached down and began to untie it from the chair when I heard a noise. Someone was walking down the stairs to the bottom floor. Fear gripped me and I turned back to the string, my hands working faster. When I turned, I came face to face with the balloon, which was now floating. Confusion swamped my mind as my fingers fumbled with the string. I could hear the feet sliding through the debris, the being coming closer to where I was at. Finally, I had the balloon free and turned to exit the room. A thin man stood in the darkness facing me. He whispered my name, slowly coming closer. I pulled the small LED light from my pocket and pressed the button, flooding the opposing room with light. Before stood me not a demon, but Nic. He had a small smile on his face, amused. "What are you doing?" I yelled. He had scared me to death and for no reason. He gave a small chuckle and pointed at the balloon. I looked at it again to see it floating as high as the string allowed it. I furrowed my brow, still confused. It had been depleted of all helium before, and now here it was, floating without any issues. I shook my head. "Why did you scare me?" He pointed at the balloon again. "That balloon isn't a normal balloon. It garners fear, and fear is all that makes it float." I squinted at him, listening to how silly this all was. I asked questions on why it was there, how my fear got there. All he did was shrug and take the balloon from my grasp. Apparently, the oracle needed fear. "Two down," he had said on the way back to his car. The hour was late and I was tired. He said he would acquire the rest of the items on his own. I agreed and asked him to drop me off. He took me home and I crawled in bed. I slept comfortably in my bed for most of the night. When I awoke, it was still dark. I wasn't sure why I woke up, but I was alert. I laid in bed for a moment, listening to the silence of my home. As I was about to drift back into sleep, I heard it. It was a faint sound, but distinct. Footsteps. Someone walked from one room to another, switching from tile to carpet. My eyes shot open and I froze. My room was totally dark, but the sound was as clear as any other. I slowly sat up and let my eyes adjust. I reached into my closet and produced my long knife. I twisted the knob to my door slowly, allowing the door to ease open quietly. I squeezed through the opening and stepped lightly down the hall. I was being a little over the top. It could have been my roommate, but he had pretty much moved in with his girlfriend. I peeked into the living room and spotted a figure. It was rummaging through my stuff, papers on the table, stuff on the shelves. It went from the living room to the kitchen, searching through all of my things. I went to the front door to find it unlocked and open. It was a person. I followed it into the kitchen and turned the light on, knife in hand. There was no sign of it, but it knew I was awake. I heard footsteps scurry from room to room, no longer trying to be quiet. I bolted back to the front door, trying to cut him off. I was welcomed with a blunt object to the face and slipped right back into sleep. When I awoke, Nic was there. I was laying on the couch with my head elevated. I tried to stand, but he wouldn't allow it. He explained I had been cracked in the head. That is when I explained there was someone in my house again and I attempted to foil them. He nodded and said the door was open when he showed up, but no one was to be found. We watched Netflix for a bit until my head started feeling better. We went through my house and didn't find much missing. Nic assumed it was a purple church follower or something similar, someone looking for information on demons. I shrugged and watched TV the rest of the morning. Nic related that he had got the rest of the items the Oracle had asked for: pure energy, raw fear, a bird talon, and a tilic root. I nodded like I knew what he was talking about and listened to his relation to the vision. He told me that in his vision he saw gatherings and sacrifices in the woods. He saw the slaughter of the little woodland bear creatures and innocent people. He saw the remains of the purple church basking beneath a full moon. Nic claimed that the full moon was 2 weeks away, which gave plenty of time to prepare. His theory was that the cult had found a demon to summon, as might not be sure how to do it. They knew who Nic was and dared not challenge him. So they broke into my home to see if I had any leads on how to summon a demon. When they broke in the time prior, they were going to try and kidnap Nic perhaps and use him to summon said demon. Nic began training me with energy manipulation. I was and am still bad at it. He taught me how to track energy, feel which was bad and which wasn't. Showed me how to use my energy as a projection and ward things away. He taught me how to use energy barriers and shields in case a demon tried hexing me or something. It was all interesting, but like I said, I don't have a green thumb per se. I can track a giant through the desert or hunt a great spider through the woods. I can't control energy very well. We did daily training and I bought a better crossbow, a legit hunting crossbow. The small handheld one had failed me before and I didn't want that happening again. It cost me some money, but it was worth it. Plus, it's awesome that I have a crossbow. I practiced during the days following up to our raid on the Purple Church, being able to snipe a Coke can from dozens of feet away. I sharpened my knives and I made sure I was ready for the night of the full moon. Nic and I had been doing some recon on the church. During the day and night there were people out there, patrolling, preparing. We found animals nailed to trees, all ready for the summoning of the demon. Nic's plan was to scare them, to show them a demon and make it terrifying. He wanted me there in a tree with my weapons ready to intervene if needed, that he would have it taken care of. I shrugged and said I was there for whatever he needed. 2 weeks of training had passed and the night of the full moon had arrived. Nic and I felt ready to foil the plot and ruin the summoning for the Purple Church. We drove to the forest and parked the car hidden behind a line of trees. I had my crossbow, maglite, and knife. Nic didn't carry anything as far as I could tell. We made short work of the trip, following the scent of smoke through the slowly darkening forest. We could see the flicker of firelight through the trees. The sun had disappeared and the cool night air took hold of us. We got closer to the burning fire to discover it was barren of any people. No one was around yet for the ceremony, allowing me to climb a nearby tree with a good vantage point. I was completely out of sight and ready to intervene on Nic's behalf if needed. Before he took off into the trees for his part of the plan, he yanked his shirt off and tossed it up to me. Confused, I opened my mouth to question why. Before I could say a word, we heard the chanting of the cult. I looked up and saw the dark figures of dozens of men and women. Many of them carried candles, others carried hatchets and machetes like before. They were ready to summon their demon. I glanced down to Nic to see no sign of him. He had already disappeared into the forest. I watched as one by one they took their place around the bonfire. Chairs, logs, and pallets smoldered all while the people around chanted in a language I was unfamiliar with. I held my crossbow tight and sat quietly on the tree limb. Several minutes passed before the cult quit chanting and all looked to the moon, wonder in their eyes. One of them spoke out to the sky, calling out to the beings of another realm. I listened intently but could not make out a single word that was said. The air grew silent and still. The group waited, as did I. A gust of wind tore through the trees. An owl hooted in the distance. Shadows danced outside of the firelight, and a being patrolled back and forth. It finally emerged from the darkness and stepped into the cult circle. It was a tall, muscular being. It had the head of an owl, a massive beak stretching out from its face. Feathers darted out from its wrists and ankles, littering all the way up each limb. It grumbled deep in its chest. The cult backed away, amazed. Clearly this was their first successful demon summoning. I knew it was Nic, it had to be. It looked like the same demon he had absorbed a few weeks prior. Andreas the owl. He spoke in the same gurgling voice, slobber sputtering from his beak. It was more of the language I did not know. The man replied in the same tongue, clearly making a command of some kind. Anger dashed across Nic's face and he screeched a terrible sound. He darted forward and brought a taloned foot up and kicked the nearest man to him. He sent the cult follower sprawling into the nearest tree. Nic continued the onslaught, slamming each man and woman into the ground or a tree. I watched with a grin, knowing these people would never try to summon a demon again.
Can you give us details about the history of the order?
I don't know the entirety of it. I believe it began with the Templar Knights, a loose group that had formed during that time to deal with such issues. When the Knights disbanded, some remained in secret to continue to help enforce the secrets of the paranormal. They turned to the monks for help and recruited any and all who showed interest or ability. When we colonized America, the order did not want to cross the sea. After Roanoke disappeared, it was agreed that the new land needed looking after. We came across each other and lived in secret. Some lived with the natives to learn as much as we could of the creatures over here. As humanity expanded, so did the order. The gold rush had members of the order right at the front, settling down to begin tracking creatures.
Tell a more recent story if you have any.
I will answer the call of trips before bed. Just a couple weeks ago, I collaborated with another keeper here in Arizona. She needed help rounding up a creature that was causing some issues up in the northern part of the state, smaller towns. She had little field experience with tracking and hunting, and I was the new guy from the Midwest who had been trained by Nic, so naturally I was recruited. We drove up there during the weekend because she had it off. This was before I even had a job here in Arizona. We got to the town that had been having issues and rented a hotel room. We split the bill and shared a room to save money. She was cute. Sharing the room was my idea, won't lie. We got right down to business and began poking around the local bars and stuff to get a lead. We had gotten a few reports on people seeing a creature crawling up and down the main road of the town. This place literally had 3,000 inhabitants, so working was easy. Not a whole lot of people to get in the way. We set up patrol and started sweeping up and down the road, looking for any sign of the beast. Locals said it was short and fat and waddled around, so we had a profile to go by. Night was passing quickly and there was no sign of it. I had found some tracks in the mud, followed them to a nearby bridge, but there was no one there. The prints weren't human, that was clear, hooved and large. We continued our search when we heard thrashing and glass breaking. We followed the sound to an older restaurant, the place dark and closed for the night. The sound was coming from behind the building. She went around one side and I the other, peeking around the corner of the building. Behind was a bipedal pig-like creature, fat, short and snouted, hairless and gray in color. It oinked and sifted through the food and trash in the dumpster behind the building. I pulled my tranquilizer from my pocket and poured a little into the rag I carried. We aren't government funded or anything, so we don't have tranquilizer guns, just the old date rape trick of chloroform and a rag. I approached the beast from behind and got just in reach to take it out. My final step, of course, it turned around and snarled at me. I tackled it to the ground and smothered its snout with the trank rag. It took a solid amount of time for it to stop kicking. I asked my colleague to pull the van around so we could load it up and deposit it in the woods. The thing could almost talk. It didn't know English, but it understood hand gestures. We pretty much told it, look, if you go into town, you're going to be shot. It nodded and pretty much agreed to stay in the woods.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.